There is something uniquely disorienting about watching the person who taught you how to carry pain disappear beneath the weight of his own. Jordan Peterson built his entire public life on a single unflinching proposition: that suffering is not an anomaly to be avoided, but a fundamental condition of human existence, and that the only response worthy of a conscious human being is to face it with honesty, purpose, and courage. He said it in lecture halls at Harvard and the University of Toronto. He said it in books that sold tens of millions of copies across 5 continents. He said it to broken young men who had run out of frameworks for understanding why their lives felt like they were falling apart. He said it so consistently, so convincingly, and with such evident personal conviction that for a generation of people searching for meaning in a culture that had largely stopped offering any, his voice became something close to essential. That voice has gone quiet, and the woman who has known him longer than any audience, any publisher, or any podcast host, the woman who has been beside him since they were 8 years old, has confirmed what the empty calendar and the vanished appearances already suggested. Jordan Peterson is not coming back to public life anytime soon, and the reason why is one of the most painful ironies his story has produced. To understand where Peterson is now, you have to understand where he came from. Not the global platform, not the cultural phenomenon, but the beginning. He was born in Fairview, Alberta, in 1962, a small town, cold and flat. The kind of place that sits quietly at the edge of Canada's prairie provinces without drawing much attention from the wider world. He grew up reading obsessively, the kind of reading that is not a pastime but a compulsion, a young mind trying to construct meaning out of a landscape that offered very few obvious answers. He gravitated toward the darkest corners of Western philosophy and psychology. Jung, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, thinkers who had stared into the worst the human condition had to offer and come back not with reassurances, but with maps. He studied political science and then switched to psychology, completing his doctorate at McGill before teaching at Harvard, and eventually settling at the University of Toronto, where he spent nearly 2 decades doing something unusual in modern academia. He told his students the truth about suffering. He told them life was genuinely hard, that meaning was real but not free, and that the capacity to bear difficulty without collapsing was not just a virtue but a form of moral responsibility. His lectures, eventually uploaded to YouTube, found audiences that no university classroom could have contained, millions of views, then tens of millions. A generation that had grown up in an era of institutional failure and narrative collapse discovered a professor in Toronto who was willing to say the things they had felt but never heard articulated. His first book, Maps of Meaning, published in 1999, was dense and demanding and largely ignored by the mainstream. It didn't matter. It was a foundation, not a splash. The splash came later. In 2016, the Canadian government introduced legislation that Peterson publicly opposed on the grounds that it would compel the use of specific gender pronouns under threat of legal penalty. He refused compliance. He went on television, made videos debated publicly, and stood completely still in the face of enormous institutional pressure. The backlash was ferocious. The support was equally ferocious. Within weeks, he had become, by almost any metric, the most discussed academic on earth. Then came 12 Rules for Life in January 2018, a book about personal responsibility, Jungian archetypes, and the narrative structure of the Bible that somehow sold over 10 million copies and was translated into 50 languages. He toured the world, filled theaters, and stood before audiences who had come not just to listen, but to tell him through their applause and often their tears that his words had reached something real inside them. At the peak of all of it, his wife got sick. Jordan Peterson married Tammy Roberts in 1989. They had known each other since childhood, since the kind of early age where the relationship that forms is not really chosen, so much as it simply becomes part of who you are. By the time he was standing in sold-out theaters, she was not simply his spouse. She was the architecture of his life, the person who had been beside him through every version of himself that had ever existed. In 2019, Tammy was diagnosed with kidney cancer. The word landed the way that word always lands, with a weight that rearranges everything instantly and permanently. What do you do when the person who is the foundation of your entire world is suddenly fighting for her life? Peterson did what he could. He kept going publicly while privately absorbing a level of fear and anxiety that by any honest measure would have broken most people entirely. He was prescribed a benzodiazepine called clonazepam to help manage the sleeplessness and the psychological pressure of watching his wife face a diagnosis with no guaranteed outcome. At first, it was just a medical tool, a reasonable clinical response to an acute crisis. What he could not fully know, and what his doctors apparently did not communicate with adequate clarity, was the cost waiting on the other side. Benzodiazepines create dependency quietly and efficiently. Withdrawal, when it arrives, does not arrive gently. By the time Peterson understood the depth of what he was in, he was already deep inside it. He tried to stop. The withdrawal was catastrophic. In 2020, in an act of desperate medical searching, he traveled to Russia for a medically induced sedation procedure designed to help his body sleep through the worst of the withdrawal process in a controlled environment. He spent a month in a Russian intensive care unit. He came back changed, diminished in ways that took years to even partially reverse. In 2022, he sat across from Joe Rogan and said something that deserves to be read slowly. He had been in excruciating pain for 2 years, at levels he had not known were possible. The man who had spent his career writing and speaking about the nature of suffering was admitting, quietly and without drama, that pain had found registers in him he had not previously known existed. Tammy survived her cancer. The treatments worked. Peterson slowly, painfully, rebuilt his public presence. He wrote Beyond Order in 2021, released it while still in the process of recovering, and went on to launch the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, an organization bringing together global thinkers around questions of meaning, purpose, and civilizational direction. He kept going. He always kept going, but the body, it turned out, had been keeping an account of its own. In the spring of 2025, Peterson was hospitalized in Zurich, Switzerland, for pneumonia. Serious but manageable, the kind of medical episode that a man who had already survived a Russian intensive care unit might reasonably expect to move through and past. He survived the pneumonia. But something else entered his bloodstream during that hospitalization. Sepsis, a systemic infection that sent his immune system into overdrive, and sepsis in a nervous system already carrying the accumulated neurological damage of years of benzodiazepine withdrawal did not simply pass through. It landed. It accelerated a process that was already underway in ways that medicine had not yet fully mapped or predicted. What emerged from that hospitalization was a man with tardive akathisia. The term is worth understanding precisely because the condition demands it. Tardive, meaning delayed, meaning the damage does not arrive in the moment of exposure, but later, sometimes long after the medication that caused it has been discontinued. Akathisia, from the Greek, meaning inability to sit still, a neurological condition characterized by internal restlessness so severe and so physically relentless that patients consistently describe it not as discomfort, but as torment, the body generating distress signals from the inside, continuously, with no off switch and no reliable exit. It is a condition known to occur as a consequence of certain psychiatric medications, drugs that alter dopamine receptor function, and around which the central nervous system constructs its entire functional equilibrium. When those drugs are removed, the system built around them is suddenly without its anchor. In some patients, the result is neurological damage that does not resolve. That persists. That can be permanent. Jordan Peterson spent 6 years trying to get free of one medication. The process of getting free left him with a condition that may accompany him for the rest of his life. By early 2026, his public calendar went blank. Not with an announcement, not with a press release, but simply and quietly blank. Events disappeared. International appearances vanished. The kind of absence that communicates more than any official statement. Then in April 2026, his daughter Michaela confirmed publicly what the empty schedule had already implied. Her father was stepping away from everything. The cause was a neurological injury sustained through psychiatric medication. The condition was akathisia. On the 4th of May 2026, Tammy Peterson gave an interview to the New York Post. It was not long. It was not dramatic. It was, in its restraint and its honesty, something considerably more affecting than either of those things would have been. She said her husband is at home with family and with companions who help him through the hours. She said his mornings are brutally painful and discouraging. Later in the day, much later, she was careful to specify, there is sometimes relief. She said he is not talking about going back to work yet. And then she said the sentence that carries the most weight of everything she shared. He feels as if he is in another realm of pain, not a different degree of the same pain, not a manageable variation on familiar suffering. Another realm entirely, a place the maps do not cover, a territory without the landmarks that ordinarily allow a person to orient themselves and identify which direction leads toward something better. She did not stop at describing his condition. She addressed the medical system directly. She said the damage done by psychiatric medications over 6 years ago requires patience, time, and loving attention. And then she said, with the kind of precision that lands harder than any raised voice, that the medical industry will have to face this evidence and take steps to protect the public from harm. That benzodiazepines should only be used in life-saving cases. That statement is not anger, exactly. It is not accusation in the conventional sense. It is testimony. The testimony of a woman who has watched from the closest possible distance what it costs a human being when a medical system prescribes a dependency-forming drug in crisis without adequately preparing the patient for what getting free of it will demand. Jonathan Pago, theologian and one of Peterson's closest friends, described what the days actually look like. Good days, he said, look like struggle and pain, but on good days, Peterson is still capable of taking walks, working on projects, and having meaningful conversations just with difficulty and never for long. Bad days are constant pain and akathisia, difficulty concentrating, lapses into discouragement and despair, never for long, even on the good ones, but still, somehow present. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship held its 3rd annual conference in London in June 2026. The institution Peterson built continued to function. The work continued. He was not there, and that absence is perhaps the clearest measure available of how serious this moment actually is. Jordan Peterson does not miss important things because he is tired. He does not step back from the conversations that matter to him because he has decided to rest. He is absent because his body will not cooperate with the basic requirements of showing up. Tammy said it plainly. He misses the opportunity to weigh in on what is happening in the world. He is aware of events. He has opinions. He has the same mind that shaped tens of millions of readers and viewers. That mind is still running. The body is another matter. There is a question, uncomfortable but necessary, that sits at the center of all of this. Jordan Peterson built a philosophy that insists on the meaningfulness of suffering, that the human being who faces pain, honestly, who carries their cross without collapsing, who tells the truth even when the truth is costly, is living rightly regardless of outcomes. But what happens when the suffering resists meaning? What happens when the body's internal distress signals are so neurologically relentless that the very cognitive architecture required to construct meaning is compromised by the condition itself? What happens when the man who told the world to stand up straight is fighting a condition whose defining symptom is the impossibility of being still? There is no clean answer to that question. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, in the way that his lectures tended to produce clean answers. But what is visible from the outside is this: he has not retracted anything. He has issued no statement suggesting the philosophy was wrong, that the suffering proved the argument false, that the ideas were comfortable fictions that collapsed under the pressure of a real test. The silence is not repudiation. Tammy speaks for him now, and what she says is not defeat. It is patience, time, and loving attention, the exact prescription she named publicly as the only treatment that currently makes any sense. He is 63 years old. Somewhere in Canada, in mornings his wife describes as brutal, the man who spent 30 years teaching the world about suffering is living inside a chapter he did not author and cannot yet close. The irony is almost too symmetrical to be accidental. Almost. But there is also something else in it, something that his own work would probably recognize. The philosophy was never about the absence of pain. It was always about what a person does inside it. The walks still happen, with difficulty never for long. The conversations still happen. The projects continue. That is not a triumphant story, but it is also not the story of a man who has stopped. The people who expect Jordan Peterson to remain silent forever do not yet fully understand who Jordan Peterson is. His wife does. She has since they were 8 years old, and she chose the word, yet very deliberately,